Zach Osterman from the Indy Star joins us. Zach, it has been a day that I wish we could go 4 hours easily and still keep going. There's so many different storylines with this USC, UCLA to the Big Ten bombshell that it's like, oh my God, where do we start? Do we start on scheduling? Do we start on basketball? Do we start on football? Do we start on travel? Do we start on someone mentioned that IU no longer leads the Big Ten in basketball national championships, which is funny. In the Big Ten now has two solid blue bloods in the conference. Bill Walton in Simon Scott Assembly Hall calling a game. Yeah, that's going to be that'll be something if they can get him off the West Coast. But there's just all kinds of storylines that can take you in so many different directions. But what are the things that are the most important things that are standing out to you?
Well, boy, what are the most important things? Again,
or big. It doesn't have to be important or big. It's just it's such a big and I said this. I think this is bigger. It's way bigger. It's bigger than Texas, Oklahoma joining the SEC. It's this. I'm trying to think back when expansion started, and I know I was always shocked, but this is still shocking, and it may be one of the biggest yet.
I think there's a couple things that have been different about Texas and Oklahoma, and then certainly what happened yesterday. Number one, there wasn't a lot of runway up to them. Texas, Oklahoma was a little bit more, but it was, those of us who covered that summer in 2010, it was months of buildup and speculation and maneuvering and politicking and all that stuff. Texas, Oklahoma happened in essentially a few days. This happened in less time than a long baseball game, at least in the public eye, obviously. I think a couple of things that are most surprising about yesterday. One, Texas and Oklahoma felt bigger in a way because Texas and Oklahoma are probably heavier hitters in college football. But the USC was the Pac-12. And I understand that Texas and Oklahoma were the Big 12, but the Big 12 was only 25 years old. Like, there was an old joke that, what was it? It was something like the Big 12 was essentially a conference built on oil futures. Like, it was, the Big 12 was never anything permanent. It was the Big 8 and the Southwest, just sort of mashing together a bunch of schools that never trusted each other and never really felt any companionship to one another at all. Like, the Pac-12, for most of the formational sort of years, and I'm talking decades of college football in this country, it was the Big Ten and the Pac-12. The SEC and the ACC to some extent, but they didn't really migrate out of the Southeast. It was the Rose Bowl. It was Notre Dame. I know Notre Dame is not in the Big Ten, but it's in Big Ten country. It's Notre Dame, USC, Michigan, Ohio State. Like, that was in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. That was where we sort of built like the cultural popularity of this sport. And USC was the beating heart of the Pac-12. This was like if Alabama left the SEC or Ohio State left the Big Ten. And UCLA, first of all, is a bigger brand than people are giving it credit for. It's just not as big as USC. But second of all, like, I don't think any of us have fully appreciated right now, because it's still so new, the fact that, like, not only did the Big Ten basically take probably the Pac-12's two strongest brands. Ultimately, that's what this is, almost certainly. But, like, the West Coast Conference is now shut out of what is effectively the capital of the West Coast. Like USC is more popular in San Francisco than Stanford. And now they're gone. Like, they're gone. And so, like, this, culturally speaking, this is a bigger deal to me than Texas and Oklahoma. And then the other part of it too, and I wrote about this a little bit yesterday. This is a very clumsy analogy, forgive me. But when one country invades another country, we all say that's a terrible act of aggression. Why would they do that? That can't be allowed to stand. But it's not until the other country fights back that we say, well, now it's a war. Texas-Oklahoma was the first move, but this was the second. This was the one that told us that the two biggest conferences in the country, the two conferences that ultimately matter, are ready to just tear down all the old rules and all the old norms, just tear the house down and rebuild it. Last summer, the Big Ten wasn't. It entered into the alliance, which has obviously become a punchline. As I said yesterday on Twitter, the real alliance was the friends we made along the way.
Keep your enemies or keep your friends close, your enemies closer.
Right. I mean, they did that essentially to act as a voting block to stop the SEC from just railroading them into a playoff they didn't want. Well, Kevin Warren might wake up this morning a lot more politically aligned with the SEC than the ACC or the Pac-12 in a college football playoff. And I think my guess is that's the next step. There's a lot of questions about, is the Big Ten going to take Oregon or Washington? Is the SEC going to go for Clemson? Where's Notre Dame going to go? Other than Notre Dame, and this may be a somewhat controversial opinion, but other than Notre Dame, I don't think there is another brand out there that anybody has to have. Like, I don't think Clemson is that. I don't think Florida State is that. I don't think Oregon is that. I don't think Washington is that. If Notre Dame is interested in joining any conference full-time, full membership, etc., that's a huge deal. Otherwise, personally, I think that everybody should pause for a minute, because I think that the Big Ten and the SEC should get in a room and decide what the future of the playoff looks like, because I think they've got immensely more control over that now than anyone else. And they own all the biggest television markets. Like, they own them. I mean, LA, New York, Chicago, Atlanta, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Philly, San Francisco, DC, all of them belong to the SEC or the Big Ten. So, like, that's the next step. That's the next golden egg to crack open. And I think that those conferences need to figure out basically what the numbers look like there, and then from there decide, okay, what's the most advantageous structure for us to build a conference that maximizes our opportunities.
Yeah, I said earlier in the previous segment that I don't know who's going to win the national championship next year, but I'll bet you I'll take $1,000 wager against whatever odds you want to put up that the winner comes from the Big Ten or the SEC. Yeah. And so, and actually I made a soccer reference of the championship league and the Premier League. Not that that's going to happen, but we're going to have that in essence without the relegation and the promotion. You're going to have these teams that are in the SEC and the Big Ten, and there might be a couple of outliers, but very, very, very few now. And you're going to have everybody else, and that's just the way it's going to be. So do they set up two different championships?
No, I mean, I think that's a good analogy, and I think what's important to kind of further that is for people to know that it didn't work that way until 1992. Before 1992 in England, it was just the first division, the second division, the third division, the fourth division, and based on how television rights were packaged and sold, they really weren't until the very late 80s and into the 90s, based on how money moved around the game. Basically, you made money on ticket sales. Ticket sales and concessions were your two primary income sources in British football until 1992, when all the top clubs got together in a room with two TD broadcasters, ITV and Sky, and said, which one of you will give us the most money to turn this into just the biggest sort of made for TV broadcast satellite all over the world product you can. And we're going to call it the Premier League, and we're going to make it harder to get up there. And we're not this money's not going to filter down to the lower leagues the way that kind of organically it did before. And so it is going to build that structure of essentially this group up here, with some exceptions, is going to be untouchable. And everybody below them, with some exceptions, is essentially just going to be kind of fighting for the scraps that fall off the table. That is, I think, where we're headed. And again, I think the question to me, absent Notre Dame, because Notre Dame throws up all of its own sorts of questions and conversations, the question I would be asking is, where is the where is the playoff? If it's an 8-team playoff, you may not need more expansion for a little while. If it's a 12-team playoff, can't hurt to put a few more, can't hurt for, the SEC to go to Miami, to FSU, to Clemson, to North Carolina and say, why don't you come on in? And for the Big Ten to go to Notre Dame, to Oregon, to Washington, maybe Stanford, and say, hey, let's, the more teams, the more the boats will rise overall. Right now, the Big Ten's got a product, as you mentioned, these schools think that their annual payouts from media rights are going to approach, if not pass, $100 million a piece. So you don't want to add anybody immediately that is not revenue positive to that. You don't want to add like Cal Berkeley and suddenly everybody looks around and says, whoa, we just went down to 80 million a piece because we added a school that's not raising everybody else. But when you figure out what the playoff looks like and you figure out how to basically where the money levers are in the playoff, it might turn out that it will behoove you to take a few more teams in, water down your TV numbers just a little bit, but give yourself way more opportunity to put teams in the playoff because that'll bring you more money back in that direction. I think that is, to my mind, that is maybe the next big maneuver. There are other complicating factors. The ACC's grant of rights runs through 2036 and supposedly would be very either expensive or logistically complicated for ACC teams to get out of. I don't think that's as true of Notre Dame. I think Notre Dame still has some obstacles, but because they're not a full member, I think they've always left themselves a little bit easier of an exit than anyone else. But if you wanted Clemson, if you wanted Florida State, et cetera, the Big 12 now, the Big 12 should be calling everybody today. Call Stanford, call Cal, call Oregon, call Washington, call all the Rocky Mountain schools, Arizona.
The Pac-12 and the Big 12. I think the Pac-12 and the Big 12 are going to have to essentially merge because they don't have that superstar. So they need every bit of the stars they can give.
What they do have, if I'm not mistaken, is a television deal coming up soon. So go to the Rocky Mountain schools and say, just come on in here. Bring Denver, bring Phoenix, bring Tucson, bring Salt Lake City. We will be the Plains and the Mountains conference. We don't really, at this point, who cares geographically what this stuff is anyway? And then it's a 16-team league. That's fun. You've got some great basketball teams in there. You've got a new conference commissioner coming over from Rock Nation who has an extensive background in basketball. Is an IU alum too, if I'm not mistaken. But there are other moving pieces. But to your point about it kind of being the Big Ten and the ACC and then everybody else right now, it already was. It is even more so now. I think the other thing to say about it is that a lot of that potential traffic, a lot of that activity that can kind of go on behind the scenes or on the periphery really probably need not trouble the Big Ten or the SEC unless they wanted to right now. I think the Big Ten and the SEC can focus on a small number of questions. Where's Notre Dame going? Does the Big Ten want to add any more West Coast schools? Is the SEC interested in trying to untangle a couple ACC schools from the grant of rights? And then, crucially, what is the future of the playoff? Because I think the future of the playoff, again, to me, is what determines is the future of the playoff, which we didn't think was going to be resolved until closer to 2026 when it comes up. I think it's 2026. But again, now the Big Ten might not feel so obstructive toward the SEC. The future of the playoff to me is what is going to instruct the two big conferences in particular on what do we want to do? What is the smart next move for us? Because neither of those conferences need anyone. They don't need anybody. The Big Ten doesn't even need Notre Dame. The Big Ten's literally about to sign a TV deal that's going to pay them $1.5 billion a year. The SEC has arguably 6, 7 of the top 10 brands in college football: Oklahoma, Texas, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, LSU. Those two conferences don't need to do anything now. But what's the line from that wonderful Clive Owen movie, the Inside Man? When there's blood on the streets, buy property. Now is the time to get moving on that. If you think that there is if you think that there is an opening to get aggressive about doing something that is going to maybe, kill off one of your last competitors or just absolutely sort of entrench you or whatever, now's the time to do it. But I would not be surprised if we don't see, other than maybe Notre Dame because they are a wild card, if we this calendar year we don't see any more expansion. But I think this is the move. This was kind of the last move. Texas Oklahoma was one. NIL was one. I heard you talking to Alec Lastly about recruiting the West Coast. NIL is going to be tremendously important for the Big Ten when it comes to these West Coast relationships. Suddenly, you can put your athletes in Los Angeles. I mean, that think about the NIL. Look at what USC is doing with NIL. It's groundbreaking. All this stuff was building toward this point. The Big Ten pulled the pin out of the last grenade yesterday. And so now the road is open to all these things happening. I just don't know that they necessarily all need to happen in the next 6 weeks, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's just I think it just gets to the point to where it's a race and everyone starts fearing Notre Dame, chasing Notre Dame. If we don't get them now, somebody else is going to get them because they are the target now. They are the last target, like you said. They are the last vestige that is that you would covet. But a Notre Dame in the Big Ten, which they're already adding UCLA and USC. Oh man, I don't know how much that increased their market viability, but I know it's big. You throw in a Notre Dame, I don't know where the number goes now. The TV number, where does that number shoot to? Does that? I mean, and for Notre Dame, it's going to give them the opportunity to triple what they're pulling in now or pulling in at the ACC. And I can't say never, but it is a long, long time before the ACC dreams of catching up with the Big Ten as far as the money that they are able to produce.
Yeah, I mean, the ACC is not catching the Big Ten in the money. That's not happening. I mean, again, you're right, Notre Dame. I don't know where the number would go. It certainly wouldn't water down what everyone's expecting. I think that's kind of the key right now is don't go add Stanford and Cal just to add Stanford and Cal. I'm not saying Stanford and Cal shouldn't be in the league at some point, but don't just do it to do it because those are not schools that in the immediate term raise everyone's, raise all boats. And that's kind of important right now, specifically, one, because you are renegotiating the TV deal. And so this is, you're at the table right now. Two, you are kind of in a period of ongoing change and flux, and you've got to remain flexible as it pertains to responding to something the SEC might do, responding to something the Big 12 might do, whatever. Leave yourself flexibility. Stanford and Cal will always be there. Oregon and Washington may well always be there. I would be surprised if they go scurrying off to the Big 12 and lock themselves in for 10 years or anything. Notre Dame is the one, though, that you can be guaranteed it takes everybody up a substantial level. Now, there are other issues there. I mean, how does football scheduling work when you have 17 teams? I have no idea. How does basketball scheduling work? I have no idea. You'd figure these things out, but these things are tangled up in TV contracts because if you take 17 teams, your TV partners are going to want to know, okay, you've got Notre Dame, you've got USC. That's great. How many times, though, am I going to get Notre Dame at Ohio State? In a 4-year period, how many times am I going to get USC at Michigan or Michigan at USC? Or are Notre Dame and USC going to play every single year like they do now? I need you to promise me that because that's inventory I need to feel guaranteed. You got 17 teams in your conference now. I love your conference basketball tournament, but I need to know how it's going to work so that I'm sure that I'm maximizing my revenues there. I'm not saying it won't work. I'm not saying it can't work. I'm just saying I don't know how it will work. And the one other thing I will say about Notre Dame, and it is worth saying this, it is it would not stop things, but it would be something people have to work through. Notre Dame is an elite academic institution, obviously. It does not look a lot like a Big Ten academic institution, though. And whenever you bring up academics in the Big Ten, people love around expansion. People love to say, "Oh, that doesn't matter. Stop talking about the Association of American Universities. This isn't about academics, etc." It's not about academics in the sense that nobody's sitting there being like, "Well, these are the U.S. News and World Report rankings for your business school and your law school and your journalism school, whatever." But it is about, for example, research grants and how many millions of dollars in research money your institutions are securing every year. Basically, every Big Ten university looks kind of the same. They are all large schools. Most of them are state schools. Most of them are land grant schools. Most of them have substantial graduate programs that bring in, I mean, I'm talking millions and millions and millions of dollars annually in research funding and things, in grant money, federal grant money, those kinds of things. That is not just presidents slapping each other on the back and saying, "Ha, yes, of course the sports are great, but aren't we also smart as well?" Every single institution in the Big Ten except Nebraska is in the AAU.
I was going to say, and Nebraska caught a lot of flack over that.
They were in the AAU when they joined. They fell out not long after that. But like, if you look at USC and UCLA, they look academically very much like Big Ten universities. Notre Dame does not. Notre Dame is different. And I won't profess to understand every little bit of nuance, but I know, and I'm talking about going back 30, 40 years. I'm not talking about any time in sort of the modern expansion era, but going back 30, 40 years, I know that conversations have been had at the highest levels about adding Notre Dame to the Big Ten. And the biggest hangups, the biggest, concerns or criticisms came on the academic side, because the feeling was that maybe Notre Dame was not the academic fit the Big Ten needed. Big Ten universities academically work incredibly collaboratively together, and it saves them millions of dollars, and it makes them millions of dollars. Again, this is not just about, numbers on a page that make everybody feel superior. This is hard, real stuff for university presidents and chancellors that manage $2-3 billion endowments and have alumni networks that stretch into the hundreds of thousands. The Big Ten's total alumni network is something like living alumni network is something like 7 or 8 million people. These are large numbers, and they are very important to these universities now and in the future. And I think actually the biggest obstacle, and I'm not saying the Big Ten wouldn't get over it, but I think the biggest obstacle in Notre Dame and the Big Ten would potentially be academics, not because Notre Dame is a bad academic school. It is a fantastic academic school, but because Notre Dame is different.
Not a research institute.
Exactly. It is not structured the same way. It does not behave the same way. And so it is worth saying that, if I'm not mistaken, it would be one of only 3 private schools if it joined. USC's private, Northwestern's private. I think it would also be the only religiously affiliated school. Again, the Big Ten would find ways to get over this stuff, but Notre Dame academically would be an outlier in the conference. And so that is something that the COPC would want to work through. I promise you. Before they had the vote, they would not just be like, "Ha, Notre Dame's here. The Irish are in, here come the Irish. Let's take a vote." Like, they would want to work through these issues and make sure that there were, there was some sort of satisfactory resolution on both sides to make sure that fit was going to last.
Well, they would have to, and that would be understandable. But I without even looking at a single thing or being smarter than I am, I would have to imagine that at the end of all of that, when you look at the ledger, it's going to be much bigger on one side of the ledger on what it brings, as opposed to what they do not bring. And I think that would far and away outweigh any potential negatives. I know that this is probably a dumb question, but any potential to dropping, say, a Nebraska, who just doesn't bring anything much to the conference, or athletically, nothing. A basketball program is 0, and the football program is mediocre at best, and just still hanging on.
I mean, I would be surprised, to be honest with you. I don't think now is the time to be cutting brands. Essentially, like now is the time to be consolidating everything you have. I mean, like if, for example, if you did that, sure, I get that argument, and I've made jokes. I mean, not even jokes. I'm serious when I say it. Like that Nebraska's probably done what the Big Ten Rutgers has, but like then then there is a substantial football brand back out there. And the Big 12 can go get Nebraska and Colorado. And suddenly Nebraska's got a conference to dominate again. And 5 years from now, Nebraska's winning 11 games a season because they're playing in the Big 12. And okay, Big 12's not as good, but like now suddenly Nebraska looks like Nebraska again. And again, you're talking about a university that draws hundreds and thousands of eyeballs, annually. I mean, millions, frankly, across the course of the season. Yes, they stink. I get that. But they don't stink, but they're not nearly what they were, and they may never be. But Nebraska games are still going to get huge viewership. Nebraska, Ohio State is still a game that Fox is going to want to put in prime time. Nebraska still has immense value in that regard, and I just don't think it's also the other thing that's worth saying is it's hard to kick teams out of conferences. Like people, right. People have said to me, like, do you think that like this could lead to the Big Ten sort of trying to cut essentially try to leave all the bad football programs like Indiana behind? And I say, no, I think what is more likely, if there is some break off in the conferences, is that the top 3 or 4 teams in the conferences just leave. It's much easier to leave a conference than it is to try and kick people out of a conference. So like, I think what's much more likely is 10, 15 years from now, whatever, Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, USC, just say Wisconsin, maybe just say, we're going to go form a super league with Alabama and Auburn and Georgia and LSU and Florida State and Miami, and Oregon will be in it, and we'll find maybe 20 teams, and the rest of you can just do whatever you want, because that's a lot easier than kicking teams out of a conference. I do not see a world where the Big Ten removes anybody anytime soon. I just don't think that's part of the equation.
And Nebraska is the only team that comes to mind. Rutgers doesn't because they have the New York TV market in their pockets. So that's the reason for the desire of Rutgers. Maryland has Washington. The Big Ten, I've mentioned this a couple times today. Now the Big Ten now with Washington, D.C., New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles. The TV markets. And Philadelphia. I mean, think about it. Philadelphia.
And you can now reasonably claim the Bay Area too. I mean, not to the extent that you can Los Angeles, but again, like I'd bet you all the money in my pockets, USC and UCLA are bigger brands in San Francisco, Oakland than even Stanford and Cal. Stanford and Cal don't fill their stadium. I mean, they're Pac-12 schools in one of the most heavily populated areas of the country, and they don't fill their stadiums. So, I guess we'll see where the Big Ten kind of, what the Big Ten's pitch is the next time it goes to its distribution partners and says, we want you to charge this much for the Big Ten network now because we've got all these new subscribers or whatever. But I would be shocked if the Big Ten doesn't walk, because again, this is hearkening back to like 2006, 2007. The way it works is the Big Ten will go to distribution partners like DirecTV or Comcast or whoever and say, we want 2 different prices. If you include BTN in your package in a Big Ten market, we want it to cost $1.40 per subscriber, something like that. And then out of market, we want it to cost 25 cents. I mean, I'm making that up. I don't know exactly what the number is, but I think when they launched it, it was $1.10 in market and 10 cents out of market. That was obviously 15 years ago, so I'm sure it's changed. I would be shocked if the Big Ten doesn't walk into that room, literally or figuratively, the next time it has this conversation. And when it puts its sort of media package down on the desk, Los Angeles and San Francisco aren't both included. And San Diego, for that matter. And San Diego's not nearly as big as LA or San Francisco, but like, I think basically the entire state of California. Like, I think that's what the Big Ten gained yesterday. The Big Ten essentially annexed California. San Diego, San Francisco, Oakland, Los Angeles, obviously, Sacramento. Like, they're going to put, the Big Ten's going to put the piece of paper down that just says, we got the 2 biggest schools, the 2 biggest brands in the West Coast. So we're going to expect, at very least in the state of California, all of you to treat the Big Ten network like it is local.
Can any one network afford the new Big Ten?
And I don't think the Big Ten would want it that way. I think the Big Ten would want its rights moved around. I think the Fox partnership will continue to be strong. I thought it was a tiny little bit of symbolism that you saw Fox analysts on the Big Ten Network last night. The president of Fox, Mark Silverman, was the original president of the Big Ten Network. He's also a Michigan grad, by the way. If you want to talk about prominent Big Ten alums out in Hollywood. Fox owns, I think it's now 61% of the Big Ten Network. It's always owned a controlling share, basically as a partner, because the Big Ten needed somebody who knew how to, work the cameras, basically. I would expect that the Fox Big Ten relationship is going to get stronger, and that to some degree, this is. I don't know that Fox was necessarily in the room for all this, but I think to some degree, maybe this is a little bit of kind of an answer for Fox to the ESPN just jumping all the way in bed with the SEC. But if you are the Big Ten, I think you're still interested in maybe filling that CBS slot that the SEC left open at 3:30 p.m. on Saturdays. I think there's still a lot of value in a relationship with ESPN, ABC. I'm curious if the Big Ten dabbles in streaming. Amazon is really interested in this stuff. Apple's really interested in this stuff. And I think that it would probably be smaller packages. I don't think we'd be talking about, Apple TV getting like 100 Big Ten football games or anything like that. But you could certainly kind of experiment in one of those spaces, probably get some really favorable terms because those companies have a lot of money to spend and they're just kind of curious to see how it works. And you could probably get good money without having to give up a lot of product, if you understand a lot of inventory, a lot of quality inventory. So I don't think you would want to be all one thing anyway. And certainly, the other part of it is you can't be all one thing because you've got the Big Ten Network and you're not just going to put everything on the Big Ten Network. But no one company can afford it. And I don't think it would be in the Big Ten's interest to sort of choke it all off either.